and we take great pleasure in criticizing the media for its lack of coverage or the lack of capacity to do well-informed stories on water and sanitation. Usually that's where the discussion stops. So today is an opportunity to pick up the discussion where it usually stops and to examine why water and sanitation stories are underreported in the media, despite water and sanitation being so important for human well-being, as we keep repeating to ourselves that they are. I also hope that we are able to ask ourselves slightly uncomfortable questions like how much of what the media chooses to report on has to do with what we as consumers of media would like the media to report on. And so when we criticize the media for its coverage of water and sanitation issues, to what extent is that a reflection on us? So without further ado, I would like to introduce Frederick. It brings me great pleasure to do so, especially because Frederick is an ambassador of the Water Channel. He is a veteran of journalism on water and sanitation. So apart from being a journalist, he kind of has a foot in either camp, as the idiom goes. He has reported extensively from Uganda, East Africa, Europe, and most recently from southern China. He has won a number of awards. I'm sorry, Frederick, we really don't have the time to list them because they are numerous.
That's fine, no problem.
But to keep up to date with Frederick's work and that of his colleagues, I really encourage you to visit the website Water Journalists Africa. You would find a link to that on the Water Channel page where the description of the webinar is, where the webinar is listed. Water Journalists Africa is a consortium of journalists who are working on water issues in Africa. So Frederick, please take over, and we will jump in from time to time.
Okay. Thank you so much, Abraham. You've heard my name is Frederick. I'm ready to kick off. And you can see my first slide. I'll be discussing the topic, water and sanitation in the media, relegated to the sidelines. That's a question. I want to draw your attention to the kid, the child there. She's called Ada. I took this picture in southwestern Uganda. She was actually from collecting water. I can see the two jerry cans. She's one of the children in Uganda who spend probably half a day collecting water, and this of course makes them fail to go to school and do several other productive work. They only concentrate on collecting water, and this takes them time. Water wells are not just situated close to their homesteads. They are far away. Some do walk for about a kilometer or 2 kilometers to reach the water points, and these are water wells and are protected water wells. So we kick off. This is an overview of WASH reporting in Africa. I've done several studies related to content analysis of the media in Africa, in several countries in Africa, including Malawi, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And in most cases, you'll find that stories in the media are insufficient. Stories about WASH in the media, in the African media, are insufficient. Yes, they are there, but it's not what we would expect to find. They are not enough, and they are actually inadequate. But if you did the proper content analysis, you will find that it is true. The coverage of WASH issues has increased over the last 10 years. The stories are increasing, yes, but it's not what you would find. The fact that we still have 345 million people in Africa lacking access to water will tell you that the media has failed to perform its duty. You find the problem is not so many journalists in Africa are interested in covering these issues. WASH, water, sanitation, hygiene field, it's not so interesting to journalists. As we'll find out as we go on, we find the reasons why, but not so many do cover these issues. Mostly when journalists in Uganda or several other African countries, when they come out of the university or any school, they kick off with reporting on politics and sports. They believe these fields are simple, and they keep off WASH. And what this breeds, a generation of journalists that do not care about WASH issues. So this is why you find that these issues, WASH stories, are buried inside newspapers, and they are not. You may not find the first page containing a WASH story. Most of them are buried inside newspapers, and if you don't have time, you just read it. Some of the bad examples of WASH stories are, when I say these bad stories do not sell, when I say they don't attract audience, they are not the stories that you would expect. So they have that means they lack. That means when journalists are writing them, don't care. They just write anyhow, and you find that the stories lack local voices. There are no people in those stories speaking. You find journalists just writing anyhow, and writing the abstract, and talking to officials, and don't talk to journalists, to the local people who are affected, and they just jump on a story and hand it in to the editor. I've edited the stories for journalists for close to 7 years, and you can't believe a journalist will sit interview an official or a politician and hand in the story. You don't find the local voices, and if there are no voices for local people, that means also it will not attract the attention of the affected people, because they don't see it as it's a story that cares about them. They are full of jargons, hard words that are not familiar to the newsreaders. When they find them, they don't care about reading them. You read a paragraph and you don't get what is in it, and you just abandon. And you go to sports or politics, where you are able to understand what the writer is talking about. They use abstract or confusing examples, and these examples are not on ground. They are not local examples. Probably what journalists usually do in Africa, they get handouts when they go to conferences, and they go to their newsrooms and write a story from the handouts, write exactly what is in the handout from the scientists. And you find these examples are okay with the scientists, but hard with the local people who do not, for example, know how to interpret these. For example, the information and pictures, things like that. They take a broad view and neglect paying attention to the details. Small details do count in journalism. If you find so many journalists writing, for example, if you're writing about a story on the effects of climate change, on water supply, you find someone is writing a big story on climate change and not paying attention to the small details, for example, how it has affected their local people, and how, for example, water bodies are drying up, and linking the drying up of a well to the climate change. They do not relate science to common experience. Again, this is what I was talking about. The readers will not find any connection. They will only see these stories as for another group of people, for example, scientists. And issues of water, sanitation, and hygiene affect more the local people. They lack humor, and that means they will not appeal to the audience. They will not attract the audience, the readers. And if they don't attract the readers, that means the newspaper or a radio station will not have advertisers, because these advertisers buy the audience. They don't buy the stories, they buy the audience. And if they did a research and found out that the media house, for example, a radio station, has no audience, they will not advertise with that media house. And what happens? Such stories will die out. They do not empower. Some journalists in Africa just write stories for the sake of getting paid. And you write a story and hand it in, and at the end of the month, you get the story count. Probably in a month, you had 10 stories and you're paid for 10 stories. They don't care about the aim of writing this story. It's not just about writing the story, but also it's about what that story will. They don't care. They lack research. Journalists in Africa, not so many of course, but some don't care about researching. They just want to write anyhow. And taking advantage of the internet, and you write good stories. Some don't care. They told you they would go to the seminar and get handouts and just write a story without researching. It's a mere superficial interpretation of WASH issues. They just interpret what they wouldn't do. Go on and write a good story from the local people and from their communities. They just want to write in a hurry and just the superficial interpretation. They are congested with several ideas and topics, and again, this takes me to the point of paying attention to the details. If you write about so many topics and ideas, you will let that story lose focus. And if the story loses focus, it will not even help you achieve your aim. And the end result, if such stories are like that, the end results, and we have seen this, stories are neglected by the editors. I mean, as an editor, I wouldn't want to use a story that will not attract the audience. And it is very common in Africa. Several media houses are private. Take an example, radio stations. In Uganda, we have more than 300 radio stations which are private. So such a radio stations would aim at making money, and you can only do so if you broadcast good stories and it attract the audience. As I said, if there are stories that you think they will not help you attract the audience, you will neglect them. Such stories do not attract the audience, so you just abandon. Lots of sources whose facts are misrepresented in stories. As I've said, as journalists write these stories, because they don't do research, they are bound to misrepresent some facts. If you are a scientist and someone, for example, a journalist, misrepresents your facts, you will never respect him. So this is where sometimes this is happening. So sources will just ignore. You want to ask them next time for another story, they will ignore you and think that you are again going to misrepresent them. So in the end, you lose the sources. Stories are buried deep inside the newspapers. Because they are bad, they are not well written, and they don't appeal to the audience. They don't help you attract the audience. So what happens? The editor will just bury the story inside the newspaper, and give it a small space in a newspaper. And at the end of this is that reporters will abandon this bit, because you see, it will not pay. You write a story thinking that an editor is going to use it, and he does not use it because it is a bad story. You have to blame yourself, but you don't know, for example. So you write a story, it is not paid, it is not used. You write another story, it is not used. So what happened? You just abandon the bit, because in most cases you find African journalists, most of them are freelancers. They are paid for the stories they write. And at the end of the month, your story count, if it is low, you abandon the bit and you go to where you think you can make money. And these fields, for example, would be sports and politics. That's why you find so many journalists. There you find that these points also are related to what we have seen. Why WASH issues lack in the African media. Lack of exposure to concepts in WASH systems among journalists. You see me talking about these things, it's because I did a postgraduate diploma in environmental journalism. But not so many journalists in Africa know these things. You will ask someone about global warming or climate change or any, facts in WASH, for example, WASH sector, and they will not tell you. And these could be senior journalists. So what happens? They don't write these stories. Oh, they write them and the editors don't use them because they see the stories are lacking. They lack something, they are wanting, you may not use it. Misinformed and uninformed local communities. You see, for you to get a good story, for example, you have to go to a community that will help you, give you facts, and you work with the community, they give you their issues and you write about them. But most cases in Africa, you find local communities are not informed. They would think everything that happens in the community is just because the government wants it that way. And you ask them the facts that are bringing this or causing that, they will not know. They don't know, they're misinformed. And again, you have to blame the media in Africa. If you don't inform them or link the local communities with the policymakers, then the gap will always remain there. Lack of time and money. I told you, most media houses in Africa are private, so they aim at making money. So they are no longer, the guardians of the societies. They are only working. Their aim is about making profits. And if they see that they will not be able to make profits in such a story, they will abandon the profits. Of course, the business of the economics of media houses of news, for example, is like what I told you. The advertisers will buy the audience, and if you are not able, if you don't have the audience, they will not come to you, and you can only attract the audience through the trust. If you build trust as a media house, and if a media house does not write good stories, it is very hard for it to attract the trust of the audience. They will always go to radio stations or newspapers where they feel they can relate to, but not yours. So the advertisers will again not buy, will not come to you. So this is why you find that because of lack of money, media houses in Africa will not facilitate a reporter to go and collect a story. And these WASH stories, most of them are in rural areas. Yes, you can find several in urban areas, slums and things like that. But if you want, for example, to get a rural story, you have to go there. These media houses don't have money. Of course, they are not so all of them. Some do have money and they are able to facilitate, but others don't. Lack of time to work out to follow up these stories. It's not just a story that you wake up and file and hand in. If you want to write a good WASH stories, you have to invest in time. Follow up, talk to the audience, the local communities affected, talk to the local leaders, talk to the scientists to interpret such issues. So some media houses or journalists, they will tell you, me, I don't have time to follow up these issues. Concentration on promoting consumption of products. This is what you find now in most media houses now. They are after money, profits. So they concentrate on promoting consumption of products. They find adverts, and you find now these stories, WASH stories, are now competing with adverts, advertorials, and if a story, if for example it's a private media house and you compare such a story with an advert, the people laying pages and the media managers will always go with adverts and abandon the story. Political interests of media coverage in Africa. So many stories in Africa are on politics, and it's not just because the journalists want. It's just because they think that's what their audiences want, and this is because they have made their audiences like politics, because they write about these issues often. So they neglect WASH stories and write about politics, and this is what now the audience is mean. That's what is in the limelight, and that's what the audience likes. So the political interests of the media coverage in Africa, and also you find some other media houses in countries where the media is controlled by government. They will always tell you, write these stories about politics, about this, And if you want to do investigations about a story, for example, on water supply or sanitation in another area, they will tell you no, abandon, do this story. The president is visiting this area. We want this story. Our political party is doing this. We want this story. Lack of interest among African journalists. It's true, like you have said. These journalists lack interest. They are after other things, for example, sports and politics, and they will abandon these stories, not knowing that they are very crucial. The media's short attention span. It is true, like I told you, some media houses do cover these issues, but they will just cover and abandon it later. They will not do a follow-up, pay a short attention to such a story, and later, abandon it and do other things, report other stories, for example, and leave these stories hanging without following them up, without doing, analysis of what happened, without giving solutions, and they just abandon such stories. Complex, boring, and hard to understand the nature of some WASH issues. It is true. Some scientists, for example, would just give you boring. Now I'm giving this as a typical journalist. Some, researchers, scientists would just hand you stuff that, or tell you stuff that it is extremely boring, hard to understand, or hard, complex, and you have to invest in time. So you find if you are a weak journalist, you abandon and you think you can do some other things. But there are other journalists who want to follow up with these stories. So what they do, they ask the researchers to tell them, give them simplest information, and you go ahead and work on it. But if you are a weak journalist, you just abandon and do other things. Competition from sensational stories, which are cheap to cover and attract readers readily. That's what I told you. Politics. You will find, you can't believe so many stories in the media house, in the newspapers, for example, in Africa. Most of them are on politics. You find page 1, 2, 3, 4, they're on politics. Page 6, 5, adverts. What happens? Nothing on WASH. So many newspapers, for example, on radio stations, they cover sports. For example, in Africa now, what is happening? So many radio stations would give 2 hours of sports analysis, and if you have Premiership, European Premiership, they will put it on, broadcast it, and do live commentary. But you can't tell them, for example, to do live commentary of the function related to WASH. They will ask for money. They will look at it as a boring thing. Okay, we'll go on. Characteristics of good WASH stories. So you wonder, what can be done? How can we write good stories as journalists? What stories can sell? So if we did, of course, what I'm going to give you is not the end of it all. There are several other characteristics, but I believe this, if as an editor, if a journalist gave me a story that provides information on key developments in WASH sector in a way that gives them meaning, I would rush to broadcast or publish such a story, because it gives such developments in the WASH sector meaning. If a story uses simple and common examples, for example, if we are talking about WASH stories in rural areas, and you use common examples, simple examples, which relate to people, which relate to readers, why can't I use it? So you find editors can readily use such a story. They give a voice to those marginalized from public debate and decision making. For the people who are affected to look at you and know that you are part of them, and start collaborating with you, giving you enough information, you have to be their voices, speak on their behalf. And again, if you want to make sure their issues are heard, you have to speak on their behalf. So such stories would give a voice to those marginalized from public debate and decision making. And these are rural people. The example, the opposite of such a story would be a story that is that contains voices of policymakers only, for example, MPs, and abandon the voices of rural people who are the beneficiaries, for example, of a water project. Report responsibly towards the welfare and interests of the society. If a story, for example, does not represent a society positively, or the interest of a society positively, they will always, abandon the story. And this takes investigating. You have to investigate and represent the community responsibly, report about issues that affect such a community responsibly, and make sure you report about their welfare and their interests. You can give an example of culture. You have to respect their culture, for example, and don't just think that they have what you think is correct. For them, it could be correct. Define hard terms, because they say now those terms that we get from scientists, hard terms like the jargons we talked about, you need to define them. Some may be hard to live out, so you have to use them and define them. Support common agreed codes of conduct. This takes me to water integrity. If we say corrupt officials in the water sector are not able to give us stories because they don't want to work in the manner that will let people know what they are doing, so they hide the information. If we want them to work in a right manner, so we have to support, as journalists, we have to support common agreed codes of conduct, so to make sure we fight corruption. Also, it takes me to a point where, as journalists, we have to use the same yardsticks. We may not say other people should not take bribes, and we journalists, we take bribes. We have to use the same yardstick for the people we report about, and we as journalists. Scrutinize and expose the malpractice in wash sector. Yeah, we have to investigate. I've done several investigations about malpractice in the wash sector. Again, this takes us to water integrity. If we want local people to benefit from this sector, we have to make sure we expose malpractice in the wash sector. And these would be the good stories that you are able to read. You see, as you write such a story, you can bring in the element of politics, so it would again be an interesting story. It captures, it goes to the politics and wash, and then it means it's going to attract the readers. Use creative and interesting language, not the boring type. The language that would make sure people are interested in reading. Not the boring type, of course. Inform audience issues that affect them personally. If, for example, you worked on a story and someone looked at it as the exact story that is close to him, the issue that affects him, and you write it properly, he would be able to buy such a story because he sees it is close to him. It is just something close to him. So, such would be a good story. Empower local people with the knowledge to demand for the deserved services. Again, this is through empowering. You have to empower people to demand for services, and people now will look at you as the place where they can always go to, as a newspaper or a radio station, to acquire knowledge on the issues affecting them. Some people in the rural areas lack knowledge, and what happens? They lack right information, and what happens? They take wrong decisions, and this affects the community. Let people tell their own stories. You have to let people tell their own stories. So you have to have the voices of the people. They tell their own voices, and the vox pops, for example, would work properly here. This is a picture I took in central Uganda from a town called Lyantonde. In this picture, you are able to see, for example, analyze the garbage management. The black material there you see is polythene bags. These are polythene bags that affect soil, for example, the facility of soils, and and you can see the skip in there, the garbage skip. It is full, so people just abandon, and and the building there is a shop, and you can see in there they have a crate of soda, and probably there were other edible things. So I mean, the house fries would fry from the garbage and go to, for example, in the shop, and edible things there. There are pancakes. I don't know if you are able to see, but there are pancakes there. And then they would do fry and go to the pancakes. And what happens? You eat and get sick. Things like that. The lady you see there is in a hot spring. This hot spring is the best in southwestern Uganda. I took this picture in a district in Uganda called Shema. What happens there? People converge and bathe in this hot spring. This brings the element of water, not just being for domestic and agricultural use, but also it has curative purposes. People come here and bathe in this warm water, the hot spring warm water, and they believe it cures several diseases. But I think it's because of the sulfur content that can help them, for example, get cured of arthritis and things like that. You find this next picture related to this one. You can see this is a bigger picture now. It's the same place, but now this is a bigger picture. Women come with their children, and there are some of their husbands. You can see the man in there, the beard. They come in and bathe, and they think this will help them cure diseases. But you see, this water is rich in sulfur. Yeah, that's the man I was talking about. This water is rich in sulfur, so they believe it cures them. But it does cure them of some diseases. So it's not just for drinking. Water is not just for domestic use, drinking and cooking food, or agricultural purposes. It can also help in curing diseases. Uganda has been planning to conserve this hot spring and make it a tourist attraction thing. It's not all is gone. There are some hopes on the African continent. Some journalists are, identifying media preferences and have formed social media networks and platforms to enhance WASH awareness. I'll give you an example of the Water Journalists Africa, the network that I head, I coordinate. It has journalists who write on water and sanitation mostly, and we established this network in 2011 during the UN Water Day in Cape Town, South Africa. By then we were 12 journalists that converged in Cape Town, South Africa, and formed this network. And since then we have been, growing, and the network now has about 50 active journalists. And the membership is free. African journalists will come in. I do edit the stories and manage the newsletter we have called the Water Sun Perspective. And I have seen several journalists, expressing interest to join. I tell them send in stories, and they send stories, they send pictures. They are interested in doing this. I know it is interesting that these stories are not paid for, but journalists are willing to write about them. They believe they can help them. They can use the network to sell themselves. They can use the network to sell the issues in their countries. And in return, I have linked so many journalists in Africa with several development agencies outside Africa, wanting to work with them in issues related to WASH, and covering stories, doing the freelancing. We are sort of going on. What we believe that there are posts on our newsletter, the Water Sun Perspective, do not just impact on the online community, because in Africa the internet coverage is still low. But we believe these stories don't just end there on the online. They also go further and go to the offline through information diffusion. And people are able, for example, those who are able to access their online are able to read and go to their communities and tell the other people who have no access, tell them about such issues, or maybe link up with their policymakers and demand for action and things like that. By this morning, when I checked, we had the 95,210 views. That tells you, of course, we have readers. There, I got some stories, examples of stories that we write, which I think can show you can show you what we do, or probably what I do. The first story I see, Marawi. That story is from Marawi. It was written by someone called George Muhango, a reporter based in Marawi. It's about water user associations, and in this story, George pays attention to water user associations and the benefits of such associations, especially in the management of water points in rural areas, and how they have helped in management of water points, the wells and the boreholes. Because the people have formed the water user associations, so they come together and manage their water points. The second story, Shadows in the Water. I worked on the story in Uganda, and it focuses mostly on the issue of water tourism. If we are able to write about stories, stories of how people access water for domestic purposes, and stories of how water is very important for agriculture, we can also write stories about how water is very important for tourism. And so in this story I focused on Lake Mburo. Lake Mburo is situated in western Uganda, so I traveled there and covered this lake, the importance and the resources in there, and how they are helping to attract people, tourists who come to to this lake. But you see that the lake is situated in a national park. Then the story from Cameroon by Edith. It's marine litter threatens aquatic life and human health. It focuses mostly on management of wastes along the sea and beaches of Cameroon, and bad waste disposals and bad waste disposal habits. Then the last one, it's also my story. The story, Pictures to Tell the Dilemma, Ada and Shakila's story. What I did, I wanted to tell the story of poor water access, and but in pictures. So I followed up Shakila and Ada. Ada is the kid we saw on my first slide. So I followed her up in the mountainous district in southern Uganda called Kaware, and I had to move with her and see what she does, go on and see where she fetches this water, things like that, and the problems they face. If you read that story, you'll at least get a picture of what it means for kids in rural Africa to go and fetch water instead of wasting time that they would have used it in going to school and doing other things. They have to walk very far and fetch water, and that water they fetch is extremely dirty. Also, that story I told that story in pictures. There are so many issues that I think I need to be covered as WASH, but as a person, I believe these are some of the stories that need to be reported most urgently. Integrity in the water sector. It is very important for us to cover the integrity in the water sector. There are so many stories in there that are not heard, because now you find journalists rushing for these small WASH stories For example, defecation, open defecation, and water access project has been constructed somewhere, and they write about water access, but do not go ahead and cover the stories of corruption in the water sector, not knowing that it is corruption that is failing most African governments offer water, for example, offer improved services, health, sanitation, hygiene services to people. The money comes, for example, from donors, and it is taken by the people in such sectors. They just eat the money. They just mismanage the money. And so it is very important for us now to cover the story about integrity in the wash sector. Prioritization of the water, sanitation, and hygiene issues in development agenda. It is very important for us now as African journalists to cover these issues right now. We talk about post-millennium development goals. We talk about such issues and how they will be handled. And effects of climate change on wash sector. Not so many people now can link the effects of climate change on wash sector. It's very important. Like I told you, the story of water shortage. I have covered several stories about water shortage in relation to climate change, and you find some shallow wells in rural areas are disappearing. They are drying up. So people, what they do, they have to buy water somewhere. They have to, they are now crying to their governments to help them construct other wells, or maybe dig for them, construct for them boreholes and things like that. So but not knowing that it is because of the issue of climate change. And it is, you see, so many journalists would want to specialize in wash journalism, but there are so many challenges. Not so many, of course, but there are several who are willing to. You find you want to, but again, you can't. It's not because of your making, but because of several others. The first challenge would be high competition from other bits. Like I told you, we have politics, we have sports. They are big competitors. They will compete. They are competing with the wash. You find if you are a journalist working on such issues, and if you find you can't get space today in the newspaper, your editor is not able to give you space. Even if you have a good story, your editor is not able to give you a good space. Space. Next time he gives you space, you give a small space, so you just abandon. I believe that's a big challenge. Corruption and uncooperative officials in the wash sector again. That's what I was talking about, the integrity. These officials fear to, work in a manner that will let them be questioned. They do not want to collaborate with journalists. They don't want to give them information because they know they are corrupt, and they don't want to act in an open manner. So they don't give us stories. You go there, interview them. For example, you have a story, you want to balance it. They don't care. They will tell you, come tomorrow, come the other day, and later, the story dies out. Lack of support from the editors and the media managers, and this goes back to the media houses aiming at making profits and not being the guardians of the society, watchdogs. So they aim at profits, and what happens? You will not get support from media, from editors and media managers, because they think such stories don't give them enough money. They want stories that they think can sell and attract the audience, things like that. Constant research. Not so many journalists want to do constant research. They just want wake up, write a story, and hand it in to the editor, and go on and do other stories. So if I find so many journalists telling me, we don't get time to do research, and if you don't do research, it means you're going to file in a bad story. Media shy experts and scientists. So many experts and scientists don't want to talk to journalists. But I also have to blame the journalists who misrepresent them. If you do misrepresent your source, a scientist, tomorrow he will not talk to you. So some are media shy. They don't want to talk to us. They want to have their research, do their research, and keep it in the shelf. And they don't care about journalists. And they don't know that you can help them link up with the other policymakers. The media's short attention span. I talked about this. You find that you write your story, and you do the first story, and the editor is going to use it. But tomorrow you tell him, I want to go and follow up this story. You tell him, no, just abandon, do this other story. Lack of support from community leaders who want to side with their voters. This is very common in Africa. If I want to give you an example of wetlands, management of wetlands. If a local leader, for example, an MP, if we are in his constituency, there are several wetlands, and the government thinks has made it illegal for people to encroach on wetlands. If local people encroach on such wetlands, the MP may not go there and tell them, please get out of the wetlands. He thinks if he does so, they will not give him votes. So what he does, he leaves them. And if, for example, environment officers will come to push them out, then the MP will come and start negotiating and telling them, just be around, we'll see what the government does. And you see, if that MP belongs to the ruling party, he will petition the government. And what the government does, the government will again come to the environment officer and tell him, leave them, let them be there. And the problems of the results of encroaching on wetlands, you find then they are the same people who do not have water because they have encroached on the catchment area. Yeah, the ones who are now being affected by, for example, by several diseases as a result of destroying the wetlands and giving pests conducive environment, the warm environment to thrive. So they start, for example, suffering from malaria in areas where there were no malaria, no mosquitoes, because mosquitoes will not, for example, breed in cold areas, things like that. The scientific terms not simplified by scientists, again, those are terms that we get, the jargons we get from scientists who just throw handouts to us and do not simplify them. Poor pay due to few story count at the end of the month. Poor pay, as I told you, if your stories don't pay, if you don't find, the editor does not use the story, at the end of the month you will not be paid. So if you are not paid, you just abandon the beat and do other things. That's a big challenge. Getting too close to the story. Some journalists who specialize in wash get close to the stories. They don't see those stories. They don't see the sources. They become friends to sources. They do not see the stories. So it also becomes a problem. But I think this is not a big problem, but it's a problem with the journalists who specialize in this beat and take long there. They start looking at stories that we think are stories, and they don't consider them. The last one is difficult to balance because of the closed nature of some African cultures. Some African cultures, for example, will not tell you things about some African societies will not tell you things about their cultures. They will just keep quiet. So as a journalist from another culture, it will be hard for you. You have to take time, explore, and for you to write a good story. Suggested solutions at the end. Training of journalists. Yes, please.
Yeah. So we have we have a few minutes left, like 15 or 20 minutes left, and then we have quite some questions. So so could I ask you to kind of speed through the last slide so we have time for questions?
Yeah, this is the last slide.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, there are training suggested solutions to the problems. Training of journalists specialized in WASH. We need so many journalists who are trained, specialized in reporting about WASH, water integrity advocacy and campaigns to make sure we talk about these issues. Facilitation of journalists to go to far off areas and write stories from rural areas and verify. Create simple WASH language that is acceptable international to help break WASH jargons. And then the last one would be editors and media managers should come up with a policy of publishing or airing a given number of WASH stories per news bulletin, for example, a newspaper. That's the end. That was my last slide. I will now take questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Frederick. Thanks for your presentation. And it was a bit of a marathon session, I guess. You had to, drink water twice. But we have the questions here in the text box that is opened up now below the slides, below the slide window. For the benefits of some of the viewers, I will kind of read them out, not word by word, but they're also there for everyone to see. The first question is from Peter, who observes that most journalists I have come across, that is Peter has come across, in Sierra Leone, for example, are not educated enough in journalism to be able to interpret the statements they get from, say, WASH press conferences and use them only as leads to follow in-depth analysis of such situations. The few who have the education sit on the top administering the media houses to take the wind of the piper's prayers. Yeah. So you could respond to that.
Yeah, I think it's the same as what I talked about. Not so many journalists are able to, write such stories. They're not educated. They lack information in these, the skills or information in these issues.
The next question is from Arno, who talks about, who says, what about the EU audit of EU-sponsored African WASH projects? The fact that half of these are not sustained. I guess Arno is referring to a recent evaluation by the EU of EU-funded WASH projects in Africa. And the findings of that study suggested that half of WASH projects in Africa funded by the EU are not performing as well, are not delivering results as they had been expected to.
Yeah. So probably you'll find, because now journalists, the media is the fourth estate. If they don't perform well to write about these stories, again, you find that the sector faces a problem. I believe you can also blame journalists partly for not writing, or, for example, raising a red flag on such issues.
I guess the other way of interpreting this question could be whether, I mean, the story itself and not how good a story the story was, as to what, in your observation, what are some of the reasons for this low success rate of WASH projects in the continent?
Sorry, could you come again?
Yeah, I guess another aspect of the question could be what, in your observation, is the reason for the low success rate of WASH projects in the continent, I mean, in different countries in Africa? If there are any common strands that you could identify and talk about.
Yes, of course, there are so many reasons, but the first one, and I think which I have covered, is about the issue of corruption. The money is given by funders, and it ends into the pockets of the people in these sectors. It does not go to fund what it is needed to fund. And what happens? These projects will not succeed because they lack funds. Or again, they will implement shadow projects, fake projects, and at the end of it all, they don't last.
Soren asks that in his experience, the media content is not decided upon by journalists, it's decided by the editors-in-chief. So the journalists are less the problem than the decision makers of the various media houses. Do you agree or disagree? And is this something that is the case in Africa as well?
I don't agree. The reason is because as the editor will always edit what a journalist has written. The journalist can partly influence the editor to like what he or she writes. If you write a bad story, if you write it poorly, the editor will not use it. So it's very important for the writers, the reporters, to know what they are writing about, to be able to influence the editors to publish their stories. You can take an example. The editor will not just sit in the office and write all those stories. He will wait for the reporters to bring the stories. And so the reporters have to bring good stories. If it's I as an editor, if a reporter gives me a good story, I will publish it. I will use it. So I don't consider, for example, like I don't want to use this one because it is wash or things like that. No, it has to be a good story from the reporter.
I have a follow-up question, Frederick, which is that you mentioned that a large number, I mean, it seems to be the norm that randomly selected journalist in Africa, or certainly a large number of African countries, is likely to be a freelancer. So freelancerism, if that's a word, that seems to be the norm in a large number of African countries. Does that give journalists more freedom or less freedom in terms of doing the kind of stories that he or she would like to do, as opposed to an organizational setup in which there is the editor, the gatekeeper, and then there are journalists who he instructs and guides and to do certain stories and not do other stories?
Yeah, of course, as a freelancer, you have enough time to do several other stories. But see now, as a freelancer, what is guiding you for you to make money? You have to write stories that sell. And so the aim now of a freelancer, if he's not a good journalist, he will only aim at money. And so what he does is to write stories that sell. If he thinks wash does not sell, he will abandon it and go to, for example, to areas where he can get more money. And so you find these freelancers now specializing in sports, specializing in politics, and in abandoning wash.
The next question is from Arno again, who asks, is there an environmental journalist association in Nairobi or Johannesburg, for example, that they could access or hook up with, look up to?
Yes, we have an environmental journalism network called ANEJ, African Network for Environmental Journalists. We can get in touch, and then I will link you up with the reporters there, or the people managing this network. I am actually a member of this network. Or you can link up with me, and I link you to reporters in these countries. Certainly in our network, Water Journalists Africa, we have journalists from Kenya, and we have journalists from South Africa.
Okay. There's a question from Otto Hoffman, who asks, it's more of an observation. He says, another example of why some journalists do not report war stories meticulously is because they pinpoint at all the negative factors about how the government has failed to provide effective WASH approaches for its citizens. Therefore, governments often threaten journalists not to do their jobs properly. And in brackets, example, South Sudan. Have you ever come across a situation personally or through one of your colleagues that you or they have felt a kind of pressure from the government to report certain things in certain ways?
Yeah, certainly it is true. I have several examples of in Uganda, of course, in Rwanda, of course, and also I think we got some examples I think it is Malawi or Zambia. Yes, it is true. Some government officials want journalists to write some particular stories they want. If, for example, it's about corruption, they do not want you to write about it because they think it is going to affect their possibilities of getting funds from donors. So they tell you, please don't write this story. So they will follow up and you write it and they can do something bad to you. But as a person, I believe the role of journalists goes beyond what those in authority, for example, the government, might want published or reported. We must do something as reporters. Of course, we can't always give in to the government.
Okay, I have a follow-up on that, Frederick, which is being a part of an international network of journalists, such as the Journalists Network, as an example, do you think that helps kind of absorb or withstand some of the pressure that national governments might be able to more to put on domestic journalists as opposed to journalists or media houses that are part of international consortiums such as Africa Journalist Networks?
Yes, yeah, I think it's true because I'll give you an example. There are stories that a reporter will file to the editor, and the editor will tell you, I'm not able to use this story for different reasons. For example, the government will not allow me to, or probably the media manager, the owners of this media house do not want it published. So what usually happens, reporters usually send them to me or send them to their networks, and then those stories are published without bylines, without names of the reporters, and the story goes into circulation.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Peter has another question. He has an observation and he would like you to comment on that, which is a lot of funds come in for WASH activities, but little is allocated for WASH journalism. What would you suggest?
Yes, it is true. I believe first because journalists themselves are not good at writing proposals, for example, for funding, and if such funds come and there are no proposals to fund journalists, for example, to make networks or for training, they will not benefit. Again, as I told you, if those funds land in the hands of corrupt officials, they may not go further. They may stop there. Or the corrupt officials may not want to train journalists who will in future learn techniques of questioning them.
Mm-hmm. Harache, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, and apologies if I'm not. Observes that we have seen increased success in gaining interest in WASH stories over the last 2 or 3 years. Do you think the negotiations around the Sustainable Development Goals or the next set of international goals will provide a good hook for further interest in WASH stories? And do you think that journalists or the public, they currently know about and understand what is happening with the Sustainable Development Goals? So with respect to the topic at hand that we are discussing today, i.e. water and sanitation stories in the media, do you think a next set of development goals, how is it going to affect it?
You see now, you will not attain sustainable development if you don't put WASH issues in consideration, if they are not covered. So it's very important for the journalists to know these issues and cover them very well, and so they can interpret this information to the people on ground to know what is happening, after the Millennium Development Goals or what Sustainable Development Goals are. The other component I think of this question is, it is true not so many journalists in Africa know about Sustainable Development Goals. No, I don't think it is true. They don't know. They don't know. I have had several organizations going into, for example, rural areas to train journalists about these things, and and when you hear journalists asking, you know very well that they did not even know Millennium Development Goals in the first place. They didn't know them. So it is very important, to make sure the journalists know Sustainable Development Goals and how they link to WASH, and why it is very important to cover such issues.
Thanks for your question, Hirache, and I'm also glad that I was close to the actual pronunciation of your name. With that, we seem to have reached the end of the questions right now. I would like to thank Frederick very much for his presentation and his answers to the questions that came in. It was very refreshing because it was a boots on the ground kind of perspective. It was very informative to listen to someone who is actually a journalist himself and has been reporting on water and sanitation issues from different parts of Africa and China. Thank you also to the audience for joining in and for your excellent questions, which made for very good discussions. I would also like to take this opportunity to point out that with this webinar, we do not aim to discuss this issue and bring it to a conclusion. This is only the beginning of a larger exercise. What I would like to ask all of you to do is to get in touch with us and share your perspectives on the issue. And what we would like to do is compile them and make a special web page and develop a special web page on the theme water and sanitation in the mainstream media, why it is relegated to the sidelines, if at all. We will soon share a recording of the webinar. It would be available on the Water channel, that is the waterchannel.tv/webinar. And also on that page, also on the Water channel, the website itself, we would soon be sharing details of this theme page that we are developing. And we will also, and thanks also for indicating your affiliations and your contact details as some of you have. We will be in touch with you shortly, and as part of our efforts to develop this thematic page. Thank you very much. Thanks all, and we hope to see you again at the next webinar. Thanks again, Frederick.
Thank you.